Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us again on another one of our Safer at Home series talks. Nice to have you with us. Before we get started tonight, just want to remind you that our talks are brought to you by Cape Cod 5 for Citizens Federal Credit Union and Martha's Vineyard Savings. And all our books in this series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you participate and take part in the locals, so they could use the business too. If you're not familiar with how we do it, if you got a question at the end, use the chat feature down below. If you would, make sure you mute yourself so we can listen to the speaker. And tonight's speaker actually, like many of us, actually wishes he could be there in person because he's doing it from Boston. So he knows where the Cape is. He could make it to the Cape. And as he told me before, if you happen to be watching WGBH, he's also appearing tonight on Greater Boston, but via tape. So we don't want you to have like he's having an out-of-body experience. So Anthony Amore is the Director of Security at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. This is his third book about art and crime. And would you welcome our guest tonight, Anthony Amore?
Thanks, Mark. Just before you all joined us, Mark and I were talking about this book, and first question he asked me was, how did I come about finding Rose Dugdale? And I had him hold off for a second because that's how I stopped my talk. As Mark mentioned, I work at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and I have a unique job. I'm the Director of Security there, but I'm also the museum's investigator looking for the stolen paintings that were taken from us nearly 31 years ago now. I remember being very depressed about the 25th anniversary, and now we're coming up on 31, and I promise you I'm trying my best. And part of that has been research into art theft, because the beginning of my career was spent in Homeland Security work. So when I switched over to the Gardner Museum in 2005, I had to get up to speed in art theft really quickly, so I just immersed myself, gave up any idea of a personal life and immersed myself in art theft and researched every heist I could get my hands on. And early on, I encountered a woman named Rose Dugdale, who pulled off the biggest art heist of her time, 1974. And that kind of stuck out with me because I really enjoy people who are outliers. I love people who don't fit under the normal curve. And throughout all my research, and I've looked at 1,400 heists now, there's only one woman who pulled off a big time score like this, and it was Rose Dugdale. And every time her name would come up to me in the course of researching my other books, or just when people would come up with this theory, and believe me, it is not a good theory, that Gardner paintings were taken by the IRA. They weren't. I would hear her name, and every time I did, I would hear something different about her and inconsistent. So about 4 years ago now, I decided I was going to delve into her life and really learn the real story of Rose Dugdale. And I spent the better part of 3 years researching her, and I miss it. I miss the research. She's so fascinating. Her life is just jaw-dropping, eye-opening, edge of your seat, just every cliche you could think of. They all are apropos. So I decided I was going to write a book about Rose, and I'm really glad I did, and I miss writing it. I miss everything about this book. That's why I really enjoy giving the lectures. So I really thank you for coming online tonight to see me. I would much rather be there and meeting you in person and signing books for you. But here's the story of Rose Dugdale. Now, of course, I'm not going to tell you the whole story because then you won't buy the book, but I'm going to tell you the fun parts. So here's what makes her unique. This is Rose, and she grew up in a part of England called Devon, and it's this beautiful estate called Yardie Farm on these rolling green hills, and with horses and other animals and every luxury a person could want. A true one percenter. Her father was the name at Lloyd's of London. Her mother was well-to-do as well. Her parents were good, sturdy people. She went to Miss Ironside School, this exclusive all-girls school in Chelsea. She lived in this beautiful apartment in Chelsea. When she would attend school, be driven by a limo driver. You know, just the type of thing that you see on Masterpiece, maybe. It was idyllic life. Um, However, when she was 17 and it was time for her to join the debutante season, which for a person of her standing was an absolute must and very important to her parents. And remember, this is the debutante season. This is not some offshoot of it in Georgia. This is the real deal where you go before the Queen and be presented to Queen Elizabeth II. And it's 1958. And what's really remarkable about that is this is the last year that the Queen is going to receive debutantes. She has decided that she will do this no more. And so this exclusive club, it's really important for the Dugdales, but Rose doesn't want to do it. And she feels like it's a meat market. It's not what she wants to do. She doesn't want to be paraded amongst a bunch of young, eligible military officers as a potential wife. And her parents are upset about this, and they discuss it with her, and she cuts a deal with them. And the deal is that she will go through the season, as much as she abhors the idea, if her parents allow her to attend Oxford. Now, one of the things I loved about researching this book was, I'm 53 years old, so I remember 1974, but I wasn't around when she was, 1958. However, it's interesting looking back at a time period that's not that long ago and seeing just how different it was. So I have two daughters. One's in college, one just is getting her master's degree. And if either of them wanted to go to Oxford, I would certainly be overjoyed. I wouldn't have to cut a deal and begrudgingly say yes, but those were the times. And that was the way a family would view their daughter, who is supposed to marry well and be a socialite, not pursue an academic career. Goes to the debutante season, hates it, but does it, is presented before the Queen and goes off to Oxford. She studies the PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. She's not top of her class, sort of middling, but thought to be very smart, but just doesn't perform well. But graduates, does well enough. Interesting thing about her, though, she doesn't shirk. She doesn't take her work lightly. She delves into the toughest topics possible. She gets into the real dense material. When she graduates from Oxford, she decides she's going to pursue a master's degree in philosophy and also study economics. And she goes to the place that I always argue is connected to all the great art heists, Massachusetts. So she comes across the United States and goes to Mount Holyoke. I should add that when she was at Oxford, she was part of the elite. She was a one percenter. She loved capitalism and all its spoils, but she did do one thing that was sort of radical. And that is when she and a friend of hers were told they could not go to the Oxford Union because they were women, they disguised themselves as men and attended the Oxford Union. And they knew this would be a big deal, so they had pictures of themselves taken, being prepared, disguised as women. You can see Rose on the left. She looks very stern and committed, and that's a great way to describe her. Here she is at Mount Holyoke, and when she's there, she's liked. She's known for her. Now, when she grew up, her mother was pretty strict, but she's at Mount Holyoke on her own now, and she's known for constantly having a cigarette in her hand and having a disastrously messy room, but being fun to be around. Again, enjoying the spoils of her wealth. She has her little sports car shipped across to the U.S. for her use. She does a cross-country trip during a break. And you can see her here dressed in her American garb with her cowboy boots and her cowboy hat and plaid shirt and jeans. And I love that because if you talk to Rose Dugdale today, she's 80. I'm sure she would list the United States as her least favorite country in the world, with Israel a close second. But back then she's in America and she's enjoying the American way of life. When she graduates Mount Holyoke, it's back to Great Britain, and she gets her PhD at Bedford College and becomes an academic. Starts teaching politics, philosophy, and economics in the city. And she's well liked by her students. She's a young professor. She's has a lot of energy. She's very vivacious. Loves to be out and about and mingling with the students. And now it's the mid 1960s. So, things are starting to percolate on campuses in the West. And it's interesting because she attends all the sit-ins and the rallies and the different events, and she's very much into the protest movement. This is Rose at the time, just giving an idea of what she looked like when she was young. Now, in 1968, there was an interesting offer to students of the West, especially elite students. And that offer was from Fidel Castro, and that was to come to what he called the Cinco de Mayo camps. And it was an opportunity for these students of the West to see the spoils of his revolution. It's just after Che Guevara has died, but he wants these students to come and see the glory of what he has accomplished. And lots of students go. And I don't have Rose's picture there, but Rose went. And it's interesting because she's about 27 in 68. And most of the other people who go are college seniors or just recent grads. So she's 5 or 6 years older, but 5 or 6 years is a big difference when you're in your 20s. So she's a little more mature, perhaps, than the other students. To give you an idea of the type of students that went, one of my favorite writers went, and he's there on the right. That's Christopher Hitchens. So he was there at the same time as Rose Dugdale. A lot of these students that went were underwhelmed by what they saw. And if you can read Christopher Hitchens' account of the Cinco de Mayo camps in his autobiography, Hitch 22, where he talks about the idea that, Castro would get up in the hot sun and talk for over 2 hours, and people knew when to applaud because all of his men up in the front would jump up and give him a standing ovation after every point he made. And they found it kind of dull and boring. And Castro would talk about how there's no prostitution in Cuba. And they would be there in Havana, and Hitchens would turn around during the speeches and see all these prostitutes lined up right outside the crowd. And they found a lot of hypocrisy there. And I tell you that because this was not true for Rose. Rose loved it. She ate it up. She ate up the lectures. She loved the people, the impoverished people in Havana. She would go to their neighborhoods and dance with them and talk to them. She barely spoke any Spanish, but she just loved being out and about with them. And then she again returned to the United Kingdom, but she returned with a new attitude. So she was veering towards the protest movement, but she was never like a full on left-wing Marxist radical. But when she returns from Cuba, and she says herself that was one of the landmark moments in her life, she's ready to become a full-time activist. So she stops working as a professor, and she opens this storefront in Tottenham. And if you like soccer, you know Tottenham, but this is a lower working class area. And what she opens here is called a Tenants Union. And a Tenants Union, she sold her apartment in Chelsea, by the way, for the money. And her father was still supporting her handsomely. And what a Tenants Union is a place where you can go for help if you, say you're a single mother and you're getting evicted, you need a representation, or you're not getting the money you're owed from social services. Rose would accompany you, and she would go into those offices, and she became famous for going in and slamming the table or turning the table up. The civil servants would tremble when they saw her coming. She was something to deal with, and she would be involved in all the protests. And that one particular protest, she met a union leader by the name of Walter Heaton, this tall, handsome socialist leader of men. He had a long petty criminal history. but they took to each other like Velcro. They were always together. They would go to protest together. Walter started working out of the Tottenham Tenants Union here, and the two of them together took up, this is 1968, now 1969, and they take up the cause of Irish republicanism. And it's not a coincidence because in 1969, the Irish Civil Rights Movement started up again, and Irish republicanism became a major cause. And as you might know, the people in the movement at this point were adopting Dr. King's nonviolent resistance type, peaceful protests and marches and such. And they tried this, but they found that, and history shows that when they do these protests, they were met with a lot of violence from loyalists and no sympathy, and in fact, a lot of violence from the police as well. So it wasn't long before the Republican movement became violent itself with the provisional IRA. Now, you're here, it's 1969, there's these battles between the British and the IRA, and you're Rose Dugdale, and you set up your shop and you put the Irish tricolors above your store. You're making a statement there, I'll tell you. So here's Rose and Wally. Wally's 13 years older than Rose, still alive today. He's 94 years old, and he's very much a vigorous guy. He talked to me for the book. He's very active on social media. He's a very likable guy. I'll tell you, it was a great relief to me. I sent him the book, and he read it, and I was biting my nails. I was more worried about him than the New York Times review, because he would make it known to the world if it was wrong. But he said he loved it. It's his favorite book, thank God. So here he is with Rose at a protest. And this is one of my favorite pictures. And this is so important to me. One of the keys to this book is the idea of looking at what happened in the late 60s and early 70s as a society, not just in terms of Rose Dugdale, and the way people viewed women then and how we view women now. And this is a prime example. You will see that later people would believe that at the time, reporters who would try to explain Rose Dugdale would say she fell under the influence of men. First, Walter Heaton. But the truth of the matter, and by Walter's own admission, is that they were following her. Rose was the dynamic, charismatic one. And this picture sums it so perfectly. Rose is talking to a reporter in their offices, and you can see how she's leaning forward, leaning in and talking to the reporter. And just look at the way Wally's looking at her. He's just so pleased with her. He's so taken by her. The other thing to notice about Walter, though, is that he's an avowed socialist and a man of the people, but now he has this rich girlfriend, and he is wearing the finest, most handsome, most fashionable suits a person can wear. And he's walking around Tottenham dressed like the king. And he also buys a Mercedes with money from Rose too. So it's an interesting dichotomy between his political beliefs and his own desires. So while Rose and Walter are doing what they do, and one of the things they do is start working to run guns over to the IRA, they run out of money. And when I say they, it's Rose, because she's the only one earning money. But they're inseparable. They're like a married couple. The problem is Walter is already married and living with his wife and daughters. And but Walter and Rose carry on an extramarital affair right in his home, right under his wife's nose. It's really, when you see the telling of it, you see how cruel it is to Mrs. Heaton. She even finds them in their marital bed. I mean, no compunction about disrespecting her. It's quite sad. So Rose is giving her money away to her clients at the Tenants Union. She's buying all these things for Walter. She gives £20,000 to Walter and his wife, perhaps out of guilt. It's not clear, but eventually she runs out of money. So where would she and Walter find more money? Well, of course, Rose's family. But they can't ask Rose's family for money because she's behaving in a way that's bringing disgrace onto the Dugdales. So one weekend, while her parents go off to the Epsom Derby, which is like our Kentucky Derby, they go away for the weekend. And Rose and Walter and another thug break into Yardie Farm. They break into her parents' estate, and they steal all of the antiques and paintings. And it's not masterpieces by the traditional definition, but all in all, they've taken tens of thousands of pounds worth of art and antiques, and that's a lot of money in 1973. It's a lot of money now. So they have clever ideas as thieves, but they're not polished thieves. So when the family realizes the house has been broken into, they instantly think it's Rose. They go to the house staff, and the staff says the dogs never barked. We didn't hear a thing, and it's because the dogs loved Rose. They didn't, everything pointed to her, including the fact that she knew what to take in the house. She took all the valuable antiques except one piece, which coincidentally was a beautiful piece she had given her mother. She left that behind. And the only room that wasn't ransacked was her bedroom. So not exactly Thomas Crown, right? But they got away with the stuff, and they were caught rather quickly. Now, they go to trial, and the wheels of justice move pretty quickly back then, and they're convicted swiftly. And the judge allows them to speak. And Rose and Walter adopt the practices they've learned from the Black Panthers in the United States. And they would use their court appearance as their bully pulpit. And Walter would get up and mainly talk about himself, though. And one of my favorite things is the judge, because of Walter's criminal history, the judge looks at him and gives him 6 years in prison. And Walter's response is, "Not since Christ has there been a greater travesty of justice," which I love the hyperbole. I mean, this is a guy that did a breaking and entering in his girlfriend's house, and he's going to jail for it, and he's comparing himself to Jesus Christ. Rose's turn to get up. She gives a long speech. Her poor and battled parents are there. They're with her every step of the way, and she looks at her father and says, "I love you, Daddy, but I hate everything you stand for." And really all he stands for is, capitalism. So Rose, the judge looks at Rose and says, "I find you guilty. You're responsible for your actions. However, I believe you fell under the influence of this man, Walter Heaton. And I believe that you are unlikely to ever offend again." And he gave her a suspended sentence and a fine, and she was allowed to go free. And she was up in arms about this. And, she said, "This is pure class justice." And I think she was really disappointed she didn't go to jail. This is a photograph of Rose and Walter when they were arrested for that housebreak. And look at them. Look at Walter's face. Again, it's such an expression. He knows he's going to jail, and he knows what it's like, and it's terrible for him. Look at Rose's face, though. I mean, this is exciting for her. This is this young aristocrat, PhD from Oxford, who is now one of the, a real, for lack of a better term, a woman of the people. She thinks she's in big trouble, and she's earned her bona fides here. But she's allowed to go free because of her station in life and because of her gender. Again, it's really ironic because she was the leader. So Walter is shipped off to jail, and it's a tragic scene because these two lovers have never been apart since they met. And here's Rose afterwards again, doesn't dislike the attention to the photographers on the street. And she decides she's going to protest on Walter's behalf, and she's going to visit him at every visiting period possible. She's going to be by his side even if he's in prison. And you can see she has her picket signs, "Free Walter Heaton, the people's best friend." And I don't know what "your fear is greater than ours" refers to, but she's out there picketing and getting attention. And what's interesting is she visits Walter for weeks and weeks. This was, I think they went to jail in October. And then right after Christmas, out of nowhere, without advance warning or any indication this would happen, she never sees Walter again. Stops visiting him, never tells him that she's not coming back. Her last time she saw him, she said she'd be back and she loved him. But just disappears, never speaks to Walter again, ever. She sent him one letter, and I'll tell you about that later. But she's gone. You can see this is not a woman mesmerized by a man by any means. And where does she go? She goes across the Irish Sea to Northern Ireland. She's going to take the fight to the man. And it's an interesting thing because this is Rose Dugdale, who subscribes to the idea of direct action. And when I explain this to college students or whatever, I liken it to walking around those picket signs is like people go on Twitter every night and rage on social media. Direct action is when you're on the front lines of, say, Antifa and you're trying to burn a courthouse. That's the difference, right? That's direct action. I'm not condoning it, obviously. In fact, throughout the entire book, one of my goals is that I want the reader to decide if this second part of Rose's life is about freedom fighting or terrorism, whether the IRA are revolutionaries or if they're terrorists. That's not for me to decide, it's for the reader. Rose's activism in Ireland is remarkable. As soon as she gets there, she hooks up with an Irish Republican Army soldier named Eddie Gallagher. But Eddie's not just any IRA soldier. He's a rogue soldier who's really rash in his decision-making, so much so that he has his own special unit, armed services unit to himself, because if for whatever you think about the IRA, there's one thing that was true of them and remains true, is that they acted with strategy. There was leadership structure and they did things strategically. Violently, yes. Whether you agree with it or not, it's not the issue, but they had a strategy and a hierarchy. And Eddie had no time for such bureaucracy. And he would go do things on his own without realizing that he might be compromising some peace talk here, a ceasefire there, a prisoner swap, what have you. So Eddie was out on his own, just the type of guy for Rose. And the two meet and they instantly fall in love. I suspected that she might have met him earlier when he was in England. And it's right away. I mean, she isn't there for a few weeks before they're the hot couple again. Eddie and Rose, Mad Eddie Gallagher, they call him. And immediately come up with a plan, a violent plan, and they execute it. What they do is they take some milk churns, large milk churns, and together with two other members of Eddie's active service unit, ASU, they pack these milk churns with explosives. And then Rose goes off and poses as a journalist and meets with a helicopter touring company and says she needs a tour for an article she's writing. And on the appointed day, she shows up to meet the captain, and she shows up with her three friends and their bombs, and they hijack the helicopter, and they force the pilot to fly at gunpoint, and they direct him to a town in Northern Ireland called Strabane. And at the time, Strabane was the most bombed city or town in Northern Ireland, and their goal is to drop these bombs on a Royal Ulster Constabulary, in other words, Loyalist police barracks. The bombs are so heavy, two have to be left behind, but they take off, they fly, and they make the pilot hover by the police barracks, and they drop the bombs, and the bombs fall harmlessly into the water and onto the rocks, and they don't explode because they're amateur bomb makers. But they get away, they escape. What's interesting to me is that when you read the interviews with the police commanders from the Strabane barracks, they say they watched this with amusement as the bombs fell helplessly into the sea. But the fact is, there was no amusement. This was an attempted mass murder. This would have killed dozens of police officers at the barracks with heavy explosives. This was a really bloody plot, and Rose maintains to this day that she was ready to kill. She understood that people would have to lose their lives for Ireland to win its independence, and she was more than prepared to kill, and this is proof of it. But she doesn't pull it off successfully. It gives you an idea of what her mindset is, and the police know she's involved, and you start seeing these wanted signs popping up around Northern Ireland, and special branch officers from the United Kingdom are looking for her. And you can see they take some shots at her. They use a really unflattering photo. They describe her as having a masculine appearance with sallow eyes and a dirty, untidy appearance. And they're looking for her, and she's traveling around, going from IRA safe house to evade capture with Eddie. She's dressed as a lady so that people wouldn't recognize her, and she hated it. She had to wear dresses and heels and such, which she didn't like. And she was met with a lot of skepticism and snares. She wasn't welcome everywhere, because you have to remember, for the people of Northern Ireland, this was life. This was misery. This was war. Rose was this British aristocrat who came from inestimable wealth. And they had to wonder whether she was just, having a go for, to feed some fancy at this point in her life, if it was a phase or if she was just having fun with their cause. No better example of the contrast between Rose Dugdale and the people of Northern Ireland than these two young women. On the right is Dolores Price, and on the left is her sister Marion. And they're about 18 on the left, 20 on the right. And Marion and Dolores grow up in a through and through IRA family. The father was a soldier in the earlier conflicts in the 20s. Their aunt lived with them, and their aunt lost her eyes and her hands in an explosion when she was assisting trying to get some explosives for the IRA. The mother worked as, sort of like administrative work for the IRA. Grew up in poverty and harassment and prejudice. And when they were old enough, Dolores went to the IRA and said she wanted to join. These are two of the first female IRA soldiers, and they're admitted, and they refused to be the type of girls who are just washing bullets and such. They want direct action too. Ultimately, Rose proves her muster in a series of holdups and driving in as a wheeled woman for people, frankly, for people who are going to be assassinated. She is appointed the first female officer commanding for a major operation, and that operation was to take the bombing campaign of the IRA out of Northern Ireland and wake up the people of Britain by setting off 4 car bombs in Great Britain on the mainland. This, they thought, might wake up to the British people to their cause. And they do it, and the bombs go off. The 2 sisters and 2 men with them, they set up bombs in front of New Scotland Yard and an army recruiting office, another government place, but in a spectacular fashion in front of the Old Bailey courthouse, the famous courthouse. And they do what the IRA was known to do. They gave a heads up to let innocent people get away. They just wanted a bombing, not killings. But their call was not communicated from the newspaper to the police the way it should have been. So when the bomb goes off in front of the Old Bailey, hundreds of people are injured and maimed, and nobody died. But imagine the horror of the Boston Marathon bombing. If nobody died, it still would have been this horrific thing where people lost limbs, and it's just a horrible tragedy. And that's what happened at the Old Bailey. And when the 4 of them went to make their getaway to fly out immediately back home, they were intercepted at the airport because the police had been told by an informant who did it. So they were captured, and they knew who Dolores and Marion Price were. Their father was a famous IRA fighter. And they're brought off to jail, humiliated, and soon tried and convicted. When they are convicted, they are sent to jails in Great Britain, in England. And this is very problematic for them because they believe themselves to be prisoners of war. And as such, they believe that they should be, political prisoners. And as such, they should be allowed, and that's what the British always did. They should be allowed the rights of wearing street clothes in the jail, being able to congregate with each other, having more visits and such. The British said, no, you're staying here as criminals. And they insisted that they be sent to Northern Ireland in a jail there to serve their sentences and be closer to their parents. The British wouldn't acquiesce, so the sisters went on, and their male counterparts went on a hunger strike. And this is the age of the hunger strike, right? Late 73, 74. And because they're women and because they're attractive and because of their plight, it makes worldwide news that these two young ladies are on a hunger strike. So the government doesn't know what to do. Should we give in to the commands, or do we let them go on this hunger strike? The government decides they're going to force feed them, which, as I learned, it doesn't sound pleasant to begin with, but as I learned, it's an incredibly traumatic experience that left both these sisters with post-traumatic stress disorder. Hopefully you'll read the book and you'll see what it consists of, and you can see why it's so traumatic. And they were dying. Despite the force feeding, the sisters were dying. They lost an enormous amount of weight. They knew they didn't have long to go. On top of the weight loss, the force feeding led to cuts in their esophagus. They had infections. It was just a miserable experience. But it was still news all of the time and a lot of pressure on the government. In February of 1974, this painting is stolen from the Kenwood House in Great Britain in Hampstead Heath. And the thieves take this painting in the middle of the night. They cut the phone lines. They lock the people in the museum, into the museum. They lock it from the outside. They make their getaway through Hampstead Heath, which at the time was, at night, was frequented by what is now called the LGBTQ plus community. So in 1974, nobody was willing to admit to being there. And so therefore there were no witnesses. And the painting disappears and nobody knows where it is. And finally, some letters come into the press and to the police that this Vermeer, this beautiful painting, which I, like any Vermeer, if you like Vermeers, you look at this and God, the questions that this painting bring to you, like why does he have her over to the left like that? Why did he cut off her arm? And, what is he implying? Is there someone there? Is there like a mystery person? Is that who she's looking at and playing for or with? And just, God, Vermeer is so great. You look at it very close up, you can see the gentle vibration in the strings. The ransom letters come, and the ransom letters say, ultimately, that the painting will be returned if the Price sisters are sent back to Northern Ireland. And then in April, at 10 o'clock in the evening, a young French woman approaches this building. It's the Russborough house in County Wicklow in Ireland. It's the longest house in all of Ireland, and it's owned and inhabited by Sir Alfred Bite and his wife, Lady Clementine Bite. Enormously rich people. If Rose is the 1%, the Bites are the 1/10 of 1%. They are heirs to the De Beers diamond fortune. And this house is populated like a great museum with countless works of beautiful art. But it's around 10 o'clock at night. And at the servant's entrance, the doorbell rings, and one of the servant's sons answers it. And he's 14 years old. He sees this young woman, and she's speaking broken English. She's French. And she says, "My car is broken down. Can you help me?" And he can make out what she's saying. He says, "Sure." So he opens the door more for her to come in, and two men with machine guns come barging through on her sides, and they get all of the house help, and they gently lock them away and keep them from interfering. Then they go to the study in the home, and they find Alfred Bite and Clementine Bite listening to phonograph, and they're violent with them. They take them, they're screaming at them that they're capitalist pigs, and they strike Sir Alfred in the head with a gun and cut him and hog tie him, and they tie up the wife. They drag her to the basement and throw her on the dirt floor, call her a capitalist pig as well. Very, very violent with the rich people in the house. And then this meek French woman breaks character and starts speaking in her English adopted Irish accent, directing the men with her what paintings to take. And she points out 19 paintings, and she knows what she's picking out. The men with her wouldn't know a great painting from paint by numbers, but she points to 3 Rubens and a Gainsborough and a Goya, and particularly a Vermeer called Lady Writing a Letter with Her Maid. They take these paintings, 19 in all, and make off with them. This is the Vermeer, Lady Writing a Letter with Her Maid. I won't bore you with going into all the great features of this, but I would tell you to please bring it up on the internet and study it, because there's so much here. And again, like a great Vermeer, it just asks questions, it doesn't answer them. And that way, I think of Vermeer as like Leonardo, where you look at the Mona Lisa and wonder. That's what these paintings do to you, aside from the technical brilliance as well. So this painting's gone as well. And now there are 2 Vermeers missing, and the ransom letters for this painting are coming in, and the same request is made: move the Price sisters back to Northern Ireland. So here's the next morning. The police, the Garda, are there, and here's some of the frames left behind, and that's, as you know, frames are left behind at the Gardner. It's very common, simply because frames are cumbersome, not for any other reason. These paintings were not cut out, they were just taken on their stretchers. Rose is soon caught. Again, she pulls off the heist, but doesn't have a good plan. She took the paintings with the 3 men that were with her, including Eddie, and they went out to a place off the beaten path in Cork, County Cork, and thinking if they went to a place like this, no one would notice them, not realizing that in Ireland, if you're not from there, you're going to be noticed. Ultimately, the police came, arrested her. I mentioned earlier in her arrest after robbing her parents' home that it seemed to me that she wished she had gone to jail because of the bona fides associated with it. This is a picture of Rose after she's arrested for stealing these paintings. She does not look like a person who is upset that she's been caught after pulling off the greatest art heist in history at the time. I really believe, and she's never said this, but it's my belief, that she needed, for her own self-satisfaction, to prove her bona fides, to go to prison. And off to prison she went. In prison, Rose became the first woman to give birth to a child behind bars. When she first got to jail, she wasn't feeling well, and she had suspicions, and she snuck off a jar of her urine to her lawyer, who found she was pregnant. And she gave birth to this charming little boy named Rory. And I think it's interesting because he was born in December of '74. She arrived in Ireland in January of '74. So she became pregnant with Eddie just a couple of months after leaving Walter. And there's little Rory. And of course, Eddie's still on the loose, and his wife is in prison, and he, as the IRA was wont to do, decided to break her out. And I'm not going to tell you that story, because then you won't need to read the book. And it's a famous, famous story. In fact, many people only know Rose because of this story related to her and Mad Eddie Gallagher. Today, Rose is finally accepted by the Irish people. This is her current day. On the left, she's at an Irish parade, a Sinn Féin parade, and she's allowed to hold a soldier's rifle. On the right, when Fidel Castro died a few years ago, she went to the embassy to sign the regrets book. And more recently, she's marching in parades and pushed in her wheelchair with Jerry Adams. And when you read the book and you look at the intersection between her life and Dolores Price's life and the way they diverge, it's remarkable. I believe that if Rose Dugdale could have been born as anyone else, she would have been born as Dolores Price. But Dolores Price went to her grave hating Jerry Adams, and Rose is very close with him. So you can see this journey that Rose Dugdale took from debutante to freedom fighter slash terrorist is a remarkable one. I hope that my story to you has inspired you to read The Woman Who Stole Vermeer. I started off by telling you how I encountered her because no one had really heard of her over here in the States. And I would tell you this, if she had been more well known, the book would be more aptly titled Rose Dugdale and Her Times. But because I am who I am, publishers like to tie the book to art theft. But she's much more than someone who stole some paintings one night. She's a feminist hero or anti-hero, depending on where you stand. And with that, I will take any questions you might have, but I really do hope you read the book. And like I said earlier, Jeff Bezos has more than enough of your money. Go to 8 Cousins, get the book. Even go to Barnes & Noble online and get the book. But whatever you do, get the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. That was awesome.
Thank you.
If you got any questions, use the chat feature down below, and I'm sure we got some questions. Without you getting too much and revealing too much on the book, but what do you think about, what was it about her trip to Cuba that made her do such a about face or seeming about face, although she wasn't completely accepting of being a debutante anyway, so she probably was, pretty receptive to this. But what was it that triggered this anti-capitalist feeling in her?
I think it's a confluence of things. Everything about this book, and the reason I was saying it would be aptly titled Rose Dugdale and Her Times, is because she couldn't have become the person she was without the events that were happening in the world at the perfect times in her life. So in the book, in the chapter I write about her going to Cuba, it's about 1968. And as everybody looking at your images and making certain assumptions, 1968 was a really incredibly volatile year. And so many unbelievable things happened, not just in America with the unthinkable assassinations of RFK and MLK, revolutions around the world and massive anti-war protests here and in England. I mean, I mentioned in the book, the Rolling Stones song "Street Fighting Man" came from what he saw at these protests. And Rose was swept up in all of this, right? And it's all happening as she's on campuses for all this time, where it's all happening. She's traveling to campuses and doing sit-ins and protesting this and that. A lot of left-wing causes or very liberal causes, not classically liberal, but liberal causes on campuses. And the whole world is on fire. The Democratic and Republican conventions in '68 are on fire. And Rose is swept up in this. And then she comes home and decides she's going to help these poor people. And then, right on cue, here's the Irish, not revolution, but revolution burgeoning in Northern Ireland for the Civil Rights Movement in '69. And it just kept clicking that way for her. Even ultimately when she gets out of jail around 1980, that's when there's a real heroin crisis in the streets of Dublin and throughout Ireland. And she takes up that cause as well. So she gets right back into it, and the IRA was secretly helping fight the drugs too. And they were violent about it, which caused backlash. But I just think there's a synchronicity between her and the world events that just put her in these positions and inspired her to do what she did.
She's obviously still alive. Said Walter's still alive. When you met them, when you talked with them, what was? Did you come away liking them, disliking them? What was your takeaway from meeting her in person and talking to her?
Well, that's the key. I never got to meet Rose in person, and that's a key element of the book. And it's a very important story. Why? So some of you might even know this because we're in Massachusetts, but in the 2000s, there were a few oral history projects taken up about the Troubles, including at Boston College was the major one. And all of these IRA soldiers spoke frankly because the person interviewing them, who I know, a guy named Anthony McIntyre, who was an IRA, served time as an IRA man who committed murders. He did the interviewing, so they trusted him. And the agreement was these interviews wouldn't be released for X number of years and until you were dead. At the same time, Dolores Price, who was incredibly disillusioned with the IRA, she and her sister hated the Good Friday Accords. They were hardliners, and this is not, as they said, this is not what we went to prison for. This is not what we fought for. This pact, these compromises. Dolores gave an interview to a great documentarian named Ed Maloney on film, and the agreement was it wouldn't be released until she was dead. And then, tragically and sadly, Dolores died unexpectedly at the age of 63, a young woman. She struggled so much with substance abuse because of the PTSD. So all of this information was released, and a lot of people who were involved in the IRA decades before were suddenly being named for crimes, and people were even being arrested. So when I approached Rose through a very, very trusted intermediary, all signals were go. And at the last minute, when she asked for permission, because she's a very close associate of Sinn Féin, she was told she couldn't. And the answer to me was, without saying who said, the answer to me was she was told she couldn't because of the certain arrests and different things that have happened from interviews with journalists. So that put the onus on me that's why the book in 270 pages has 600 footnotes, because if you don't have her cooperation, then you better be very well sourced. And that's why when I was able to speak to Walter Heaton, and he gave it his enthusiastic thumbs up, I felt very relieved. And I vetted it through IRA, I don't want to say too much about, but I vetted it through people who would know. So nobody has questioned any of the accuracy or authenticity. And Rose had given a couple of really in-depth interviews before all this stuff transpired, and they're heavily used in the book.
How long did it take you to research this?
It was around 3 years. I enjoyed every second of it.
Something like researching is a labor of love. Now, somebody had a question here. What becomes of her son?
Rory is a well-adjusted, wonderful, likable young man. He works, I believe he now has like a contracting business. He and I stay in touch. He lives a happy life. When she gave birth to him, she had him for a short time, and then he had to ultimately leave. She said she didn't have the maternal instinct anyway. And he went and stayed with a Republican-friendly family that raised him. And then he went to stay with Eddie. But he loves his mother, and his mother loves him.
I think we'd be remiss about you got into the art. Working for Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, it was kind of your first foray, as you said, into the art world. And now you've written about art and theft. I'm sure most people ask you about what your theories are. What do you think? What do you think happened to the paintings? I mean, I might as well just ask you.
Well, I can't. I'm the investigator, so I can't give theories and tell you what we believe. But here's the stuff I can tell you. I'll tell you, number one, again, it wasn't the IRA. It wasn't Whitey Bulger. Most of the time, if you've read it in the newspaper or seen a documentary about it, it's wrong. It's deadly wrong. There was a recent one on the BBC saying it was Bulger and the IRA, and just keep, one of the things you should always think about, in my 15 years working on this Gardner case and seeing all these different productions about it, I've learned to look at documentaries so much more skeptically. And if you ever see a Gardner one and you see that I'm not in it and I'm not discussing a specific topic, like if you don't hear me saying, I think the IRA did it, then you shouldn't believe the IRA did it or Whitey Bulger, because if I'm not involved in it and the FBI is not involved in it, then there's a 50,000 page FBI file on this case to which the documentarians and the book writers had no access, right? So how can they possibly know what they're talking about? And it's not me being defensive, it's me giving you a perspective. When you watch documentaries, really pay attention to who's commenting. If you're watching one that like the police wouldn't cooperate, doesn't mean you shouldn't watch it, but you should remember, man, the police know a lot more than the people producing this documentary do. So I don't believe the paintings left the country, because art stolen in the United States never leaves the country. I don't believe the paintings were destroyed, because paintings like this are never destroyed. And I know this because I've researched 1,400 art heists. I don't believe that the paintings were rolled, because there's no evidence that the paintings were rolled and placed into tubes. It's incredibly unlikely. It isn't the mafia, so to speak, when people keep referring to the mafia having done it. It wasn't Miles Connor, who many of you know. I mean, if you live in Falmouth, you've probably heard of Miles Connor. Anybody out in the Cape? Miles is, for better or worse, a really close friend of mine. He helps me all the time. He did not do it and doesn't have them. I'll answer direct questions to the best of my ability, Mark, if anyone has them.
Oh. Well, somebody had asked that, but we got another question about Rose. How much money does Rose have now, and does she live like a typical quote unquote Irish person, or?
How much money Rose has is a real mystery to me. So when her parents passed away, they were good to her, and they treated her like her brother and her sister when they left money. They didn't, despite the monstrous ordeals that she put them through. I mean, they were on the front page of the paper all the time. It's really sad. They gave her a third, but I don't know what she's done with her money. My guess is that she donated it all, because she does not live in a nice place. She lives in, lower middle class Dublin, and she doesn't dress well, and she doesn't live high on the hog. It's just her books and her cigarettes, and she doesn't like to be bothered, and she works on causes for Sinn Féin. So she does not live like her parents would have envisioned when she was born.
Did she even reconcile with her parents?
Oh yeah, the parents. It's an interesting thing about parenthood. I have daughters, and you can understand it. It's like it would be really hard to say, even if your daughter humiliated you publicly for years, for you to still say, I'm turning my back on you. It's a difficult thing for a parent. And when she gave birth to Rory, the mother was there. They sent her all sorts of gifts. They sent all kinds of money and gifts to the people who were raising Rory. Mother would paint pictures for him, and the parents always came back to their little Rose.
Somebody's got a question here. How did you get into investigation before you started working at the Gardner?
My first 15 years were sort of unique. I worked in agencies that are Homeland Security agencies now. So I worked for what is now CBP. Then I was an FAA special agent. And that's a unique job. Doesn't really exist anymore since 9/11. And in that job, you do investigations and security. So I was uniquely qualified to go do the Gardner job, because that's security and investigations. So I learned how to be an investigator for security crimes with the federal government. And then when I came over to the Gardner, it was a perfect fit. And I worked for 2 years with a retired Scotland Yard detective sergeant inspector, who was an expert at recovering art, larger than life character. He's my greatest mentor, just passed away in November. Just devastating loss. But so I had great teachers.
this was obviously a labor of love for you. I can tell you love this topic. What's next for you? And do you take a little break from Rose before you get into your next one, or what's your next work?
Now, I'm one of these people that looks at your life and thinks about how much time you have left and how long it takes to write the book. So that means how many books I can write. I'm like, I don't know how to like sit back in this chair and take it easy. So um, this book is probably going to be a limited series on television. Um, that increases the pressure on me on my next topic. I'd like to do like a little niche topic, but I have to like get something that's a little more eye-catching. I'm balancing a couple of things, but one case that really intrigues me is the biggest coin theft in history, in terms of, like Greek and Roman coins and that type of thing, collectible coins, numismatics, is that what it's called? So anyway, as I said, all roads lead back to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the biggest one in history happened at the Fogg Museum in the 1970s. And it's a really interesting story. And I'm researching it to see if I can make it an interesting book. But I'm not 100% sure.
Is that just an odd coincidence, or is it a reason why Massachusetts has this unique little niche in the world?
I don't know. Massachusetts was the Wild West for many years. The first armed robbery, first museum heist at gunpoint was in Worcester, 72. First time art masterpieces were used to negotiate with prosecutors was the MFA in 1975. The biggest heist in the history of the world of anything ever was the Gardner Museum in 1990. This coin heist is the biggest ever. The biggest theft of property from a private home was 1972, I think, in Stockbridge, out in the Berkshires. It's just something in the water here in Massachusetts.
Now, you said Rose was not a professional criminal. Those Vermeers were recovered, right? And brought back to their original owners, or to their owners?
Yes, and when you read the book, you will not believe how they were recovered. I should have mentioned that. You're going to read it and be like, what? You're just not going to believe it. It's amazing. It's amazing. In fact, a good friend of mine just finished reading the book, and we're going to lunch next week, and she said, I want to ask you about blankety blank. That's the first thing that came to mind about how that guitar player was recovered. And if you read the book, you're going to learn this unbelievable connection between the guitar player that was stolen in England and Lady Writing a Letter that was stolen in County Wicklow, and how they were together almost exactly 300 years prior, and then went divergent paths and come back together in crime 300 years later. It's just remarkable. I think that's what makes an interesting book.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. This has been great. I wish you good luck and success in recovering the Gardner paintings. I know that's ultimately your focus, but good luck with this book. Thank you for joining us tonight. This has been a real honor and a real pleasure. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Good luck with this.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.